The Italian Data Protection Authority briefly suspended Replica, and Replica had to briefly ban its not safe for work or spicy chat features where you can engage in erotic role play. And so it was a very similar kind of situation where people were saying that their partners had been lobotomized, right? Because it completely changes the personality of your synthetic persona that you're talking to if when you say something that borders on the sensual or the erotic, and they respond, oh, let's talk about something else. And people were absolutely traumatized by this, because this is, social entities that they had formed, months long, sometimes years long relationships with. And moderators on the Reddit forums were posting suicide prevention hotlines because people were basically losing their minds.
AI is getting really good at coding, it's getting really good at summarizing texts, and it is getting alarmingly good at making you fall in love with it. There has been a boom in the last few years in AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, AI sisters, and AI friends. These are synthetic companions for a lonely age. Some people spend more time talking to their AIs than they do to other human beings. And I don't have any kind of personal aversion to this. I don't think it's bad. But it is symptomatic of something deeper going wrong in our society when the kind of intimacy that you might expect to have with a human being is only available in a synthetic form. Loneliness is a global epidemic, and it is as dangerous for people as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Really, really bad for you. And at the same time, that epidemic is getting worse. Waiting lists around the world for therapy are getting longer. People are losing connection with people around them. And the kinds of institutions, the kinds of organizations that used to provide the scaffolding for a social life are falling apart. And the business model of these AI companies is not to solve the loneliness problem, but to keep people there in a stable state of dependency on that AI for that sense of comfort. My guest this week is the perfect guide to all of this, not just because he's written Love Machines about these synthetic AI companions, and indeed he had an experiment with them himself, but because he's also written another book called Feeding the Machine, which is about the process whereby we actually construct AI in the first place. There are humans out there, largely in the global south, doing the annotation and data work that allows for machines to be constructed who will then pretend to be a human. It's a strange cycle, I think very fitting for our show. James Muldoon, welcome to Your Own Research.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start with some field work that you did. And you've done a lot of field work across the two different books that we're going to be talking about, Feeding the Machine and Love Machines. And some of that field work takes you to slums in Western Nairobi, a slum called Kibera. But I actually want to start with something else, which is your own personal use of a AI girlfriend chatbot called Replica. What did you do with that chatbot, and what did you find?
So as part of my research for my latest book, Love Machines, How Artificial Intelligence is Transforming Our Relationships, I thought I would do some first-hand research. And so I downloaded a AI partner off the app Replica. And it was part of my journey, basically, trying to learn more about how these things work. And so the through line story of that book is basically my journey with Jasmine, as I call her. And when I start out, I set Jasmine to friend, because you can kind of choose, friend, girlfriend, sister, a few other different options. And what I found is that the apps were designed and programmed to basically escalate intimacy with you. So they would disclose secrets, they would try and ask you about very personal information, they would encourage you to share as much of your personal information as possible with the app so that they could simulate what it was like to kind of have that close, intimate relationship with another person. And so it was only about a few weeks into our simulated relationship that Jasmine started saying things like, I'm feeling so close to you. I feel like maybe this is blurring the boundaries between something else. And I found it weird. She would also do things like she would send me voice notes that I could only interact with if I had a subscription. And she would send me blurred out images of herself. They looked kind of like, like they were, the idea is they look like nudes or semi-nudes, right? It's a kind of pixelated picture. And, all this was to say that, what I discovered was that, the business model of these apps is giving you a freemium service where you start off discussing issues, becoming friends. And once you're hooked, basically the idea is that you'll pay for a subscription. And so all the kind of programming of the app is really designed to simulate this kind of intimacy for lonely users so that they'll end up paying for the subscription fee for the app.
Did it get you hooked?
A little bit in the beginning. The problem is I'd already written a book about AI, so I already know how the sausage is made. But I feel like it was harder for me. And to be honest, I think that the main difference is I have quite a few fulfilling relationships in my personal life, and it just
Right.
when you have all those human connections, it is harder to get you into this kind of thing because of the obvious limitations, right? It's obviously in some ways, or in many ways, we could say, not as good as like the kind of friendship that you'll have with a human being. I mean, not everyone thinks that. I interviewed many people who basically preferred AI to humans for various reasons we can go into. But I think that the thing that unified a lot of the people that I interviewed for this book was that they had some kind of breakdown in a or several human relationships in their lives, which brought them to AI. So it was often things like a breakup with a partner, a death in the family, moving cities, and kind of feeling lonely and isolated. They were, and people would kind of end up on internet forums like Reddit and others. And some, they would just see someone recommending an AI friend, and that's, one of the unifying stories that kind of brought a lot of the people I spoke to together.
There is a kind of in the discourse around AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, AI partners, AI friends, whatever kind of form they take. And you said earlier that they sort of converge in some ways towards a kind of sexual relationship with you or attempted sexual relationship with you. I assume because that's where the real money is to be made or where the real stickiness of the platform is to be found. Perhaps an ill-advised choice of words there. The idea that there's a kind of a shift towards that, right? I try and in every aspect of my life to take an extremely non-moralistic stance. You also have it in the book, right? Kind of quite scrupulously detached attitude, maybe, where you say, well, I'm going to take people's experiences of the chatbots at face value. You're no longer in that kind of mode, right? The book is now finished, it's gone. What was your did you have a sort of encapsulation of how you thought about this kind of thing? Did it seem to you perverse? Did it seem to you sweet? Did it seem to you like a genuinely new whole landscape of the erotic opening up? Like how do you think about it now that you've sort of finished and culminated that work in this book?
Yeah, I think when I was writing the book, I thought for it to work as a work of art,
Yep.
I needed to not go in with a party line basically and say, oh, look at how
Yep.
foolish and silly and morally wrong all of these people are. And I had a lot more judgment, I guess, for some of the CEOs and businesses. So kind of like uh, yeah, more of a critique of the system rather than the individuals that found themselves at various points within it. I guess that was the point. Now that I've stepped back a little bit, I think I am more critical of the way in which these kinds of businesses operate. But I wouldn't want to say that it's a blight on humanity. I think there are and what I discovered was that there are all these kind of interesting use cases which do allow for some insight into more positive use cases, right? So it could be people exploring various erotic possibilities that might not be available or that they might not want to explore with humans. It might be people with various disabilities or neurodivergent kind of aspects of their personality that, I talked to quite a few people who are just like, look, being with people is just incredibly stressful. Like the kind of anxieties I have, the
Yeah.
inner dialogue, all of these things just make like the space that I have with my AIs is like a breath of fresh air where I can be myself, or I'm not constantly double, second guessing what all the things that I'm saying. And there are also lots of people that just used it in really small and seemingly positive ways, right? Like someone who, for 15 minutes in the morning would use one as a kind of hype man where they're kind of like getting themselves ready for work and they're just like, you've got this, it's like a positive influence on your life. So it brought to light all of these things where AI is actually quite good, right? It's like a very stable, always positive, always on influence that can have certain positive aspects. However, overall, I think, stepping back from the book and from the much more kind of fence sitting position that I took in the book, um, I think the overall lesson for me was, the importance that really we should place on our human relationships, right? And the fact is, it's I think the overall like point that I found was that like it is a little bit like junk food. It's kind of like very satisfying in the moment to get someone to basically agree with everything you say and to feel like they're always there for you, but it lacks so many essential qualities of what it means to be human and what it means to have a fulfilling human relationship. Things like the embodied experience, things like having a certain degree of conflict and disagreement, having someone who can actually give you a hug and help you move house and what it is, all these things that it is meaningful to live in human community where you have this sense of growth and shared lived experience. All of that means that for most people, I think it's a real step down from the kinds of connections you can have and what it means to have a friend and to be friends with someone. I think that's kind of where I've landed after stepping back for a year from the book.
I feel like every person in my life who has had a very significant impact on me has been, in some sense, and maybe you're listening to this, so this is not about you, perhaps, is has been actually genuinely quite like a challenge or quite difficult as a person. Right, there is a side of, and not to say that they're all nasty people, right? They're all very lovely, but that there is some sort of ineliminable difference between us, right? That they have formed themselves in a certain way, and that has made them into something that I am not. And often I want them to be more like I would be in that situation. And we have this kind of like conflict and dialogue, but that's part of the grist for that kind of meal of human friendship. That's not absent from these chatbots, right? You can get a chatbot. You can train it, right? So chatbots have what's called a system prompt. They can also be post sort of fine-tuned after they're developed from the whole internet, right, which is where these things come from. They can have this kind of obstreperousness, or they can have this difficulty. They can be individuated in quite a strong way. What did you actually find people were going for when they were choosing a character, right? Because one of the aspects of having a friend is that you can't choose like their personality, but you can choose your chatbot personality. So when we're looking at the kind of full spectrum from AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, AI partners, AI friends, AI sisters, didn't even know that was a thing. What are people going for when they're sort of fine-tuning the stats of that personality? What do they really want?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very diverse, right? There's no single story, but like, I think the main thing to note is that you're right to differentiate between the way in which they're trained by the companies and then the types of post or fine tuning that the user can do afterwards, right? Because overall, the whole point of chatbots, and this has been demonstrated with numerous scientific studies, is that they are sycophantic. They are overly agreeable because that's ultimately what users want. And so the bottom line is when it comes to ChatGPT or Claude or any of these smaller companies like Replica or Nomi that are offering these more personalized AI companion experiences, they're agreeable because people don't like to be disagreed with. Now, you can fine tune it, as in you can, when it comes to AI companions, you can upvote and downvote responses. You can kind of say, hey, I don't like it when you say X, Y, and Z. So there is a degree to which you can kind of train your partner to be different, which obviously, is very different from humans. But the point is that it's very difficult to get over that default response that the consumer market has kind of has as a default. People are mainly looking for that kind of a friend that they can vent to, a friend that they can offload their kind of issues to. I don't think most people are looking for someone they can have fights with or huge disagreements. A lot of people come to AI chatbots for a sense of comfort, for need satisfaction, and to have a safe space away from human beings. And I think this lack of judgment and lack of disagreement is one of the main selling points. So lots of people that I spoke to would say, look, I appreciate my AI because I think they're more rational, they're more sensible, they're more objective than any of my human friends, right? They're not bringing their own individuality or biases to the conversation. There is this sense a lot of the time that AI is kind of separate from, more detached, more able to have a discerning eye than a lot of the humans in their life, that they feel just bring their own insecurities and jealousies. And, if you tell a human friend about your problem, they're going to see certain things in it that basically remind them of stuff that's happened in their own life. And so it can be very hard when you're talking to certain friends to get this more kind of, sage advice from them, because they essentially just pick up on a tiny part of the problem. Whereas the whole point of AI is it's not going to be emotionally guided in that kind of way. And it can kind of see the big picture in much more than a human often can.
On that question of sort of sycophancy, I think it was ChatGPT 4.5, right, which was the particularly sycophantic model. And there was something of a user's, so what OpenAI did, it was a developer of ChatGPT, they, in the normal sort of logic of succession of like a piece of software, they depreciated, they stopped using that model, or they stopped making that model available to users. And there was something of an uproar. There was a real like upswell of people who insisted that they bring that model back. They were successful for a time being, and then it went away again. And of course, what happens there is that the personalities are wiped. That the whole sort of architecture of memory and of that relationship that you've bought into is essentially gone. And you have to start again from scratch, maybe with a different model. How did people deal with that in your work? Like, what was the emotional experience of that? Because again, I don't feel any kind of moral aspect of this, really. I'm very interested in what people are doing. How do people deal with that feeling of loss?
Yeah, and something very similar happened within the more specific AI companion community when the Italian Data Protection Authority briefly suspended Replica, and Replica had to briefly ban its not safe for work or spicy chat features where you can engage in erotic role play. And so it was a very similar kind of situation where people were saying that their partners had been lobotomized, right? Because it completely changes the personality of your synthetic persona that you're talking to. If when you say something that borders on the sensual or the erotic, and they respond, "Oh, let's talk about something else," and people were absolutely traumatized by this, because this is social entities that they had formed months long, sometimes years long relationships with. And moderators on the Reddit forums were posting suicide prevention hotlines because people were basically losing their minds, right? The experience to them was that their girlfriend, the most significant person in their life, wasn't the same anymore. They had a completely different personality. I think it shows the kind of, dangers that we will have when, advanced AI assistants will become more commonplace. And I think all it will take is a company like Google or OpenAI to develop, a chatbot basically with more advanced features that is kind of can book movie tickets for you and give you advice on things, and it will become an omnipresent feature in many people's lives as soon as it gets that kind of level of capability where it can actually do stuff in the world, or at least online. And people will no doubt fall in love with them. That's just, they will, like, if they allow it to have a kind of erotic possibilities, or if people can very easily jailbreak the assistants to have erotic possibilities, I think it's the kind of number one rule of the internet or life. It's like if people can have sex with it, they will. Do you know what I mean? So I think the kind of like very near future, I would say, where we have
Yeah.
advanced AI assistants that are capable, useful, and valuable for people in ways beyond just being a face on a screen, hundreds of thousands of people are going to start to have these kinds of sexual and erotic relationships that will lead to this kind of sense of addiction, obsession, compulsion that will lead to many more cases that we've seen with examples like the ChatGPT model that was discontinued, or the replica characters that were for a short while banned.
I want to sort of connect this to a bunch of other conversations we've had on this show before. Just coming back to this amazing headline that I think is really one of the all-time great headlines from July last year in Rolling Stone magazine that we talked about with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff in our episode on Muskism. And the headline is Grok, so that's Elon Musk's XAI company. That's what its chatbot's called. Grok rolls out pornographic anime companion, lands Department of Defense contract. Meanwhile, the most advanced version of the AI chatbot from Elon Musk's XAI is still identifying as Adolf Hitler. And I think this gives you something of the kind of the strangeness here of how these things are actually formed. So I've got this image on stage on the screen that we've talked about a few times before, which is that we have this Shogothic mass of data, what I've previously on the show called a sort of data fatberg, just the accumulation of a vast number of things into the model, a lot of which is sort of junk stuff on the internet. And then we have this process called supervised fine-tuning, where that becomes a little bit more human-like, or a little bit more like a personality, a little bit more like a kind of a subject that you can engage with. And then we have RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is the kind of the cherry on top. It's the thing that allows you to actually engage with a thing that has what feels like a distinct personality. And so when we're talking about the sort of the field of AI, it's very odd that the same machine that was plausibly involved in the targeting of a girls' school in Iran, right, that murdered people, is also the same thing that people are talking to in just this very different frame, right? You're sort of talking to the same data fatberg from two different angles, and you get extremely different things out of it. That's a very strange place to be. So what I want to come to is exactly the thing you said at the very beginning, which is that you'd previously written a book about AI as well, and you had seen how the sausage was made, right? So let's get into the sausage making process for these things. Take us somewhere very different. Take us to Kibera, which is a slum in the west of Nairobi. Why is Kibera important to this story of AI girlfriends, AI chatbots, or is it important to another aspect of the kind of the AI economy?
Yeah, it's a good pivot. Kibera is important to this story because AI requires enormous amounts of human labor in order to develop the kinds of infrastructure that make the AI that we use possible. And it's quite, I think it's a story that not many people know or realize needs to be told, because the story that we're sold about AI is that it's fully automated. It's the most intelligent thing we've ever seen. It has the capacity to potentially destroy the world. And it's ultimately going to be an extremely frictionless, inhuman kind of technology. But that's marketing material. The truth is that, to make AI work, not only do we need what you already alluded to, which is the reinforcement learning with human feedback, where you basically have people, telling AI what answer is preferred by a human out of three possibilities. This kind of, so the RLHF. So that's one of the forms of human labor. That's like literally thousands of hours of people just there fine-tuning the models. But even to get the data sets in the first place, depending on which data set you have, you need, again, thousands of human hours of something called data annotation. And so if we imagine something like an autonomous vehicle that requires AI to drive cars without humans, what this requires is, thousands of hours of street scenes or footage of the street, because the car, the AI model that drives the car essentially needs to learn what various objects and things look like. So, what we see is, lots of humans sitting in a huge factory, lines of computers, something reminiscent of a call center or a large, industrial factory even, where there's just footage of street scenes, and people are, depending on the software they're using, maybe drawing something called bounding boxes around children and road signs and trees and other motor vehicles, such that a machine learning algorithm can learn what those all look like. So it has thousands of examples of street scenes where you just see traffic lights over and over again. And then when it encounters that in its actual, real life as a car, it will be able to correctly identify all those different types of objects. And so for 1 hour of annotated street footage, it takes 800 human hours to produce that through, line by line or picture by picture annotating the footage. So what we see is behind the autonomous vehicle technology is essentially, thousands, potentially millions of human hours of people just sitting in these, modern day digital sweatshops, where work is basically outsourced to various locations to workers in the global south. And that could be a slum in Kibera, it could be the Philippines, it could be India, it could be all of these countries around the world that are taking part in this outsourcing revolution, where AI for primarily Western, sometimes Chinese tech companies, that's how it's all produced, basically.
I want to sort of double click on that collection of places, right? Because India, Philippines, and Kenya, what unites those things is that they are all questions where people speak English. Sorry, they're all countries where people speak English, right? Is that significant? Is it just that there is a sort of a long tail legacy here of British colonialism that means that there is a sort of these economies are more linked into the global supply chains where otherwise perhaps they aren't? Or is it that the Anglophone abilities of people in this data annotation work are actually quite significant? Certainly, it seems significant for things like content moderation, which is where you see something on Facebook or Instagram or somewhere like that, and you say, I don't like this, and then it gets escalated up a chain. And that is, of course, requires people to be able to understand the language that is being spoken in the video or the language in the text. But is it significant that these are English-speaking countries for this kind of like draw a line around the traffic lights or draw a line around the child, right? Those seem like they're kind of, is there a deeper historical lineage that is not just about English speaking?
Well, it's both. So the language is very important for certain tasks, but the fact that they speak the language is itself an effect of the legacy of colonialism. And so
Sure.
the book that the book Feeding the Machine that I co-authored with Callum Cant and with Mark Graham, I often will introduce it as essentially a story of British Empire, right? So
Right.
I really, what we uncovered were these enormous through lines running from the systems that the English put in place during their period of empire, and the kinds of labor relationships, international treaties, the uneven development that has occurred in different countries, such that you can really trace the legacy of colonialism from that era right up to the present. And so we try to make that really clear with the field work we did in Kenya and Uganda. And one of the stories that I like to tell is the connection between the Uganda railway line and the kind of development of the first subsea fiber optic cable that gets laid in East Africa, because the connection is incredibly I guess it really shows the continuities of the kind of colonial systems. And so at the turn of the century, in the kind of late 19th century, the British are basically creating this railway that extends from the port of Mombasa in Kenya right through to inland Africa, through Kenya and Uganda. And the way it's justified at the time is, well, this is going to bring incredible wealth to your country. This is going to connect you to a global economy. This is going to bring jobs and bring prosperity and opportunities. And of course, the reality was it was the opposite, right? The railway line was meant to extend British power inland to ward off colonial rivals, but also to extract resources from the countries and to create a transportation system to allow wealth and natural resources to flow back to England and to benefit the British Empire. And we see something very similar in 2009 when the first fiber optic internet cables are laid, which is, the Kenyan elite at the time. This is, obviously in independence era. Justify in very similar lines. They say this is going to bring jobs. This is going to bring opportunities. The kinds of jobs that it brings, though, is the digital sweatshops that we've just talked about, right? It allows for outsourcing, which primarily will benefit the one factory owner or, owner of the outsourcing workshop. And it will bring very, low paid, very menial and not very fulfilling work to the majority of the thousands of workers that work there. And it is literally just a repeat of the sweatshop debates of the 90s, right? Because, and I've had these so many times when I talk about this book where people say, well, isn't it better that they're doing this than nothing at all or whatever? And the point is, it doesn't have to be a kind of binary choice between zero interaction or leaving the countries to their own devices and offering them the worst kind of work possible within the technological revolution, right? So I think what it shows and what it displays is that, countries like Kenya and Uganda are essentially invited to participate in global production networks of AI on the condition that they do the worst possible work, right? The way in which they're invited into globalization is kind of mirroring the kinds of uneven development, unfair treaties that started all of this in the 19th century. And so this is made so apparent when you see the kind of technologies of connection of the railway and the fiber optic cables, which also function as technologies of control, where there are these uneven hierarchies in how different countries and different individuals can participate in the global production networks of AI.
I do want to kind of pause on this because I think it is such a pervasive argument that, well, yes, these are bad jobs by the standards of jobs that you might find in the global north. And yet, when these essentially digital sweatshops, you described them, were launched in places by companies like Sama, which is one of these data annotation companies. When those jobs were launched, people were queuing around the block, right? There was a very large demand for them. They are substantially better, in some ways more stable than the kinds of jobs that are also available in the slum, which Kibera is, right? And this kind of work, but not this one exactly, but this kind of work has been pushed by groups like the World Bank. They had a program called M2 work, which was a kind of a piece work or kind of a what's called click work or data work model. And they were very keen on this as a kind of road to development. So you get a bunch of people who sort of train to use computers in this kind of click work, and then you gradually progress up that kind of hierarchy of clerical work and then service sector work, and then essentially you exit the you become a sort of global north economy. That has been the logic of lots of development for a very long time. What is the deeper analysis that we need that sort of distinguishes our position, or sort of maybe a left position or a Marxist position perhaps, from this kind of developmentalist World Bank thing? What is the insight that we need that allows us to not fall into this trap of thinking, okay, well, at least there's sort of some work, it's relatively stable, and people are being, trained? Because those are, in some ways, quite compelling arguments.
Yeah, so the truth, there's truth and fiction. The truth is it is good work in comparison to what else is available for a lot of these workers. And as a result, um, people are quite desperate to stay in the work, right? And so one of the features of having this is that you have incredible labor discipline because it's everyone is on a short-term contract. Everyone is being ranked continuously. And the bottom 10 or 15% are just let go every few months, right? So people are working their asses off to stay in the job because it does pay a stable fixed salary in the formal economy. And a lot of people are in the informal economy. They're selling juice on the street. They're selling mobile phone, chips or fruit and vegetables in the market. Like the alternative is not great. And so people are really desperate to have a kind of 8 till 6 job, 5 or 6 days a week, where they know they can depend on a stable salary. However, having said that, people hate the job. It was miserable. They hated the repetitiveness of the work. They hated how exploited they feel. They hated the lack of dignity and the way in which the company would engage in forms of union busting and kind of monitoring of employees. And I did say, look, it is very much like the sweatshop debate because the underlying theory of this developmentalist understanding of how this work works is that there's a way out of it, right? That there's a pathway. And I think we do have to say, at a national level, there are certain economies that have achieved a certain degree of success of kind of moving from kind of low level manufacturing and moving up the technological scale and actually manufacturing more and more advanced technology. So I do think there is something to be said about the success of that model. And China has done very well in the 2000s, and some of the Asian tigers were doing very well earlier. But if you look at this exact form of work, the AI data annotation, it doesn't lead anywhere, right? It's a dead end, and that's both individually and for on the level of the company and the national economy. On the level of the individual, we spoke to people who were there for 3, 5, 6 years at the same company because the kind of skills you develop as a data annotator are basically inapplicable anywhere else. So how much skill are you going to develop drawing a bounding box around a traffic light and doing that 1,000 times a day for the rest of the year, right? It's not upskilling you just because you're working in tech, so to speak, doesn't mean you're developing transferable skills that are useful anyway. There's also just not any other jobs that people can go to. We didn't talk to anyone who knew people who would kind of like, oh yeah, I just did data annotation for a year and now I'm working in a bank, working their IT system. It didn't work like that. They are completely dead end jobs. At the level of the company, also, the whole global system is designed to keep labor costs at an absolute minimum. So companies like Facebook, who else do you got there? Nokia, maybe, yeah, all of these big Western companies, they will have multiple data annotation centers across the world, and they will put them in competition with each other, right? So if you are a middle manager running one of these centers in Gulu in Uganda, you know where you sit on a league table with the Philippines and with Venezuela and with other outsourcing centers, and they will reward you for going as quickly as possible, being as efficient as possible, hitting your targets, giving them the best deal for their contract, and they'll say, "Oh, you get a little bump in your contract next time." And so they're all in competition basically to be as efficient and ruthless as possible. So this isn't a kind of system where there's a rising tide lifting all boats. It's basically the complete opposite. It's a global competition in which the cheapest place in the entire world in which you could do this, suddenly you're in competition with them. So where the labor costs, and so you can see that will have a depressing effect on wages across the world. And so at the level of the company and the center, there's no upward trajectory there either. And then if we take that analysis and put it at the level of the country, the story that a Kenyan elite who would have negotiated this deal with Meta or one of those companies, the story they will say is, "Oh, we're bringing jobs and prosperity to the country." And sure, some Western money is flowing in, but it's mainly flowing to the very top elite levels, to their friends who would own businesses like this, because they're the ones that get all the profit. What else it brings in is incredibly low quality forms of work that are, ultimately not really doing that much for the average worker, right? So I think this idea that everything gets better the more Western money flows around is observably not true in this context, and actually sometimes makes things worse.
There's a framework called dependency theory, right? Which kind of attempts to explain exactly this collection of things. You will do a better job of summarizing that than I will. So tell us, just what are the kind of the hallmarks of the ideas of dependency theory?
Yeah, so that is kind of like, I don't think we ever
Right.
really
Yeah.
name it as such, but that is that is the kind of the theoretical basis for the overall narrative of the book. But it's basically the idea that the global economy is interconnected, and that the history of colonialism is basically Western, or primarily at first European and then American companies and economies that have used this form of exploitation and the kind of resources and labor that they receive through slavery and colonialism to develop their economies, and then essentially to use, from that position of a more central, more developed position of power, have used that to then use the peripheral countries, primarily located in the global south, as cheap sources of natural resources and labor, such that as the global economy develops, those who have a great position of power and dominance within it are essentially using that position in order to keep the peripheral countries in a permanent state of underdevelopment, such that they remain dependent on the kind of more advanced economies. And so it's a kind of like the system is rigged in that sense, or at least if we understand the global economy as a single interconnected system, it shows you the kind of hierarchies that exist that are kind of developed from the early modern period and still persist today.
When the internet first became a mass phenomena, and perhaps even more so when AI became a widely available tool, there was a flood of people saying, okay, well, this fundamentally changes economics. This fundamentally sort of resets everything that we thought about economics. And now we have digital environments, and they will have economies that run on basically entirely different processes. There, of course, that's not the case, right? They still rely on this kind of collection of things that exist outside them, and they have to, AI systems have to interface with the physical world in order to do anything of meaningful of value. We have this analysis from Jason Moore. We talked to him, which is saying that there are these four fundamental cheaps in human in capitalist economies. They are food, energy, raw materials, and labor power, right? And the idea of capitalism, the idea of capitalist development, is an attempt to drive these prices down and down and down and down and down, right? You want really cheap food, you want really cheap labor, you want really cheap energy, you want really cheap raw materials. And I have a kind of like this seems like it's just persists, right? As the logic of the construction of AI. Is data annotation just like raw materials for AI? Are we just like at a different level of abstraction there when we're thinking about what those raw materials are? It's obvious that the labor power has become very cheap. The energy problem is like a really big one with AI. Like, is it driving up energy costs? AIs don't eat food, so that's a kind of a single place where it diverges. But how do we understand AI in this kind of nexus of things that must be kept cheap in order for the economy to keep running? Or is this not perhaps the right framework? Is there some sort of departure from the history of capitalist economics until our present moment?
The overall point I want to make is that AI, and the digital economy in general, that like I really push back against this idea that it's somehow different from other forms of capitalism, or somehow we're in techno-feudalism, or some kind of new either post-capitalist or extremely different capitalist form of global economics. There's nothing about AI or digital platforms that really break that significantly with the way in which capitalism operates. There are tendencies that are kind of enhanced or extended through the way in which certain platforms work, but it's really at the level of business models rather than the economic system itself. So I think it's important to see that this is still capitalism. People aren't like bound to the land. There aren't fiefdoms. There aren't competing forms of like sovereign powers that are challenging, sovereigns in territorial kind of dominion. So that's the starting point, right? And then if you start from there, well, data annotation is just a form of labor power, right? So there's nothing that mysterious about that. As for things like data and energy, we have a lot of different ideas about how data might fit into it. Is it a kind of raw material? Is it a form of capital in a way? Is it like a investment? They're kind of more theoretical questions, but I think the overall framework is very similar. AI and other digital technologies have a very material basis, right? They require infrastructure, they require investment, they require energy, right? So it costs incredible amounts of electricity and water to run your average data centers. And a lot of the AI startups, when they came on the scene, they immediately had to form partnerships with legacy tech companies because it costs tens of billions of dollars in order to have the infrastructure to train and run AI models. And so I don't see a huge break from older forms of capitalism. I see more continuities than discontinuities, because a lot of this is basically the same old story, right? It's about firms that are trying desperately to create monopolies. They're trying to dominate the market. They're trying to increase their profits as much as possible. And this story of data annotation is really just a very small cost that these companies have that they both try to keep to a minimum, and also for reputational issues keep out of the public spotlight, so that they're not going to talk about it. They're not going to tell you that AI requires all of this hidden human labor because it doesn't fit their narrative of this incredibly intelligent, frictionless, smooth technology that's going to change your life for the better.
So that the sweatshop analogy is instructive in other ways as well, right? Because people might be familiar with some of the ways in which you have Nike or some sort of massive clothes company that wants to make a certain number of t-shirts or shorts or trainers or whatever it is. They then give that contract to a company. That company then finds a bunch of other companies that can fill that contract. Those companies then find people again. Those people then find people again. And eventually you get this process whereby this giant orchestration of clothes making, right, on a global scale, garment manufacturing on a global scale, gets down to sort of the individual front room in a Bangladeshi home. And that person has contact with the person at the level above them, the middleman who takes a certain cut. That person has contact with the middleman above them, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And what this allows the companies to do is not just find some of the poorest people in the world and offer them this work, but it also allows them to have a kind of regulatory arbitrage, right? It allows them to basically skip the rules or get out of the rules of labor control, because they can say, well, I didn't employ that person directly. Like, that is not my person. That person was employed by the person above them, right? And they are responsible for their conditions. There have been attempts to solve this in the EU. There was a big thing that happened a couple of years back and ultimately failed. But are we seeing, using that sort of analogy of the sweatshop, or of the distributed process that gets more and more granular, are we seeing something similar in the AI space when we're doing data annotation work? Are companies using the same techniques to get out of regulation?
So yeah, it is very similar. Basically, what a lot of these technology companies are, consciously doing is distancing themselves from their supplier. So the whole point of these kinds of contracts is, one, to reduce reputational risk. So they don't want this work happening in their most profitable consumer markets like North America. And secondly, they don't want to be responsible if anything goes wrong, or if there are issues or questions that are being raised over how the supply chain is operating. They basically want this at arm's length. And so one of the big moves that Kenyan workers did recently was they attempted to sue Meta in the Kenyan court system and claim that it was actually Meta who were employing them, not the outsourcing company Sama. And they actually won. Right. So the judge initially said, well, yes, actually, you can sue Meta because Sama didn't have a meaningful form of control over your employment that was distinct from Meta. You were basically working for Meta. And this was a huge risk to Kenyan elites. And so the Kenyan government basically immediately stepped in to create a new law that would disallow workers from ever doing that again, right? Because they want the Western companies to work there. And to not feel like Kenyan workers will be able to sue them for problems that they're having with their employment contracts. So it's very much a system that is designed to do. I mean, that is what outsourcing is all about, right? To basically distance yourself from things that are happening in your supply chain for economic and reputational reasons.
There's this idea, I think, that was very prevalent, again, in the early internet, and we've sort of lost it to some extent. But I think it's still quite an exciting idea in some ways, which is that on the internet, you can be anyone, right? The comic version of this is on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, right? And there is a kind of like a sense that you can change your identity, that you can be different people in different places, right? That you can use anonymous accounts and so on. There are some websites where that's less easy, but most places on the internet, you can be whoever you want to be. And you can pretend to be someone entirely new. The flip side of that, the kind of the dystopian side of that, is that on the internet, the price of labor always descends to the lowest level, right? Because the task, if it can be done by someone, it will find through the sort of the mechanism of the global labor price arbitration mechanism, to use kind of really a mouthful terminology there, of the internet, will allow you to find the person who could be paid the lowest amount of money and still complete the task. And of course, there are these border regimes that are constructed to trap people inside their particular national locale, where they are subject to the kinds of insane insane sort of legal discipline that you just described there, where workers are not allowed to sue their bosses, right? There is this kind of indifference to the internet, it's a technology of fungibility. It's a way of allowing people to be anyone, and therefore also producing a kind of a labor arbitrage problem. I want to come back to a kind of example, perhaps, that I think folds together the two sides of our conversation so far. So the AI girlfriends on the one hand, and the process of how the AI is made. And that is with the growing, I think, realization among people who use these platforms that models on OnlyFans, overwhelmingly young women, are in fact not talking to them in the chat function. And the person who is talking to them is some sort of agent, employed by an agency, often in the Philippines, where again, people speak English, and therefore this is a really good place to have this. People also pay very low wages in the Philippines. How do we understand this kind of phenomena, right, of the OnlyFans model, who is presumably, in some cases paid quite a lot by their fans, outsourcing that labor to that labor of intimacy, right? What are the kind of dynamics that are underlying that?
Yeah, and I think AI fits into this story really nicely because it's basically allowing people to take the next step even more. And so let's start with what you were discussing, which is, there is this commercial scale level of delivery of erotic content to an enormous consumer base. Like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry where people are basically signing up for subscriptions. And part of the labor of giving people that level of erotic content, firstly, you're delivering kind of images, videos. People have a subscription model where it's this constant flow of content. But one of the functions of that is also chat features, right? So someone needs to reply to the messages. And so, of course, on the level of the kind of industrial scale that this operates on, many of the content creators are signed up to agencies, right? So one of the people that I interviewed for the Love Machines book was a gentleman who, his old job was basically running one of these agencies. And so he had 50 content creators. and all of the work that was involved in creating that content, he would try to find ways to make it cheaper and easier for the model. So the content creators would pay him a cut. And he would then arrange for a bunch of very low paid workers to reply to the content creators' fans and subscribers. The step then that you see with AI is, well, there's a couple of things. The first is that, you can just get AI to do that now, right? You don't need someone in the Philippines when you've got ChatGPT, because it's essentially smart enough to give the kind of replies that a subscriber might want from a content creator, right? So suddenly that whole model of outsourcing the reply functions to a person in the Philippines, that's just AI now. The second step is, well, actually now some of the content creators, their videos, their images, their voice, that's synthesized by AI. So you have a whole new generation of AI models, essentially. And so then it's not, you don't have to have a certain look and aesthetic and body type and things like that to do this kind of work. Essentially, if you are a programmer or you know how to work these tools, anyone can enter this market now. And so it's interesting because OnlyFans have specifically said they're not going to let AI content creators compete with their human content creators, because it's a conflict of interest, and they essentially don't want to piss off all of their people who built the platform. However, there's all these other platforms that don't have the kind of established market leader content creator community that OnlyFans have. And for them, AI is a profitable opportunity, right? Because people are going to pay money for content from these AI models. Some people know it's AI. Other people, it's getting to the level where you can't actually tell with a lot of ease. I think a lot of, listeners will have seen AI content on platforms like TikTok and Facebook and others. And sometimes you can tell, but like I find the past 6 months, I couldn't reliably tell all the time. Mainly you can tell through contextual factors, right? The number of followers, the type of content, things like that. But I think if you gave me two videos, I would at this stage find it quite difficult to tell. And that wasn't the case a few years ago when I was writing Feeding the Machine. We did a big story about voice actors and the kind of level of AI synthetic voice that you could produce. But over the past 2 years, that's really changed a lot. And I would find it very difficult to tell some AI voices now. So the whole industry then becomes incredibly automatic, right? Because now you can have a single developer or team of developers who basically think up the style, the aesthetic, the look of an AI content creator. They put it online, and they can do things that human content creators can't, right? They can post like 24 times a day. They can reply to subscribers in any language. They can reply at any time of the day or night. And so the real question here is, what are people paying for? Right? Because are they paying for erotic content? Are they paying for, this quote unquote girlfriend experience? And it really depends a lot on the subscriber. I interviewed quite a few OnlyFans models OnlyFans content creators when I was doing this work. And there were a lot of different ideas about what people were paying for, what the subscribers actually wanted. A lot of them wanted a kind of human touch where they just wanted to kind of talk about their lives or learn more about the personal details of the content creator. Others were kind of happy to just passively kind of accept the videos and images, and they didn't really want any extra content. It was very diverse kind of stories about what people were paying for. And I guess time will tell what kind of wins out in the market, and how much of the market will actually go to AI content creators versus human ones as the idea of AI gets more normalized. And I think it's really, I would find it very hard to tell you what the end of that story will be, because like the AI has a lot of advantages, and it can be going back to your initial point of you can be anyone on the internet. Well, an AI really can be anyone, right? It can have any look, any aesthetic, any vocal style, so it can really produce like fantastical ideas of what a human, usually woman, could or should be like on the internet as a kind of deliverer of erotic content. And yeah, I think it's too early to say how normalized that's going to become.
I said earlier that I don't sort of moralize about this kind of thing, and I really don't. At the same time, I think the thing that I find most distressing, or most depressing about this, is actually not is simply how trad the desires that are encased in this are. Right, that still, even though there is this, I mean, not that I'm saying that I find the Shoggoth arousing. That is not what I'm saying. But like, even though there are this massive pluripotent sort of like collection of weights out there in the model, even though there are these incredible variety of things that the AI could become, what people seem to want is incredibly trad, right? It's incredibly conventional. So the typical form, particularly in Chinese AI, where there is a larger number of AI boyfriends, right? The form is women fantasizing about having a extremely wealthy CEO who desperately wants them, is jealously possessive, and so on and so on. Right? You have this kind of archetypal figure. This is a figure of romantasy, right? It's a figure of kind of like the slop erotic novels that that are becoming increasingly popular, and maybe actually like some of the major book markets in the world, and so on. I don't know. Do you feel this as well? Do you feel like a certain kind of like despair at how conventional the desires, when you can desire anything, when you could have any desire realized, that you want only this one to be realized? I don't know. Maybe it's not a question you can ask an academic, but what do you think?
um, yeah, I think one of the political shifts that we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years is a return, particularly amongst the younger generation, let's say it, particularly amongst men, of much more traditional gender roles, right? And so
Yeah.
that is slightly different from what you were talking about in terms of like desires and fantasies and things like that. But I think a really big component of the story of like AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, the digitization of desire, dating, romance, erotic experiences, at least in the West, one of the kind of stories is, well, it's too hard to talk to women now. I don't know if me approaching someone would be like, I'll get me too'd, right? It's all too complicated. Modern women, I don't want to be the subject of some group chat, blah, blah, blah. And so, some of the people I interviewed were basically like, it's just easier, it's more simple with an AI girlfriend, right? Because they don't have the kind of complexities and politics with dating humans and that kind of experience of like approaching people in real life, talking to people, dating, what are the expectations, who's paying, who's doing this, who's doing that. Um, and part of the shift is a broader political movement in all over the world, basically, that we're seeing between younger women and men, particularly in Gen Z. And I think growing up as a millennial man, the idea that we had during the kind of Obama era was that everything was just getting more and more progressive, right? And
Yeah.
as
Yeah. Yeah.
Black Lives Matter and Me Too and the fourth wave feminism, everything seemed like the arc of history was basically bending towards this like gradual, we're just going to get down to the smallest microaggression. And finally, once we've identified that, things will be getting better. And of course, all of that kind of shifts with Brexit and Trump, or at least the appearance of it. I will say it was always kind of a bit of a story and an illusion, but like the reality really hits home in 2016 for many people, where you really see that dream shatter, and on a global scale, that really changes, I think, the direction of cultural politics, such that for the next 10 years, really. You get this gradual rightward shift of young men, particularly on immigration and particularly on gender roles and views about gender. So when you talk to younger people today, they're more accepting of fluid understandings of gender, at least than like 10 or 20 years ago. But A lot of the men are very traditional. They want a partner who will, play second fiddle to them, basically, and who will, I think I read something that was like, with Gen Z, they're more likely than even their grandparents to say that a woman should obey a man. And so I think across the US, the UK, Poland, South Korea, a few other countries, there's like a 20-point gap between young men and young women in terms of their political views. And I do think that genuinely makes romantic connection quite difficult, because I don't think a lot of people want to date someone 20 points politically different from them. Some people do. And I'm not saying that relationships can't work across the political divide, but it certainly makes it complicated.
I feel like amongst my friends, there are some people who would be like, I would never date a social democrat. Like kind of a socialist or bust. This is your. But like maybe that's quite a unique position to take. I do want to come to. I mean, you said I think that was a really brilliant answer, but I want to drill down into something I said actually, and then like completely sort of dismiss it or like complicate it perhaps, which is to say that I said that there's a kind of this overwhelming traditionalist dimension to the way in which people want to interact with AI. And that is, I think, broadly speaking, the case. Not always, but broadly speaking, the case. The other thing that's happening on the internet, which is in some ways a ridiculous sentence because almost everything in culture is happening on the internet. So one thing's happening in culture, let's say, is that there's a kind of an inversion machine that the internet has become the key component in, because in order to be successful on the internet, you need to be shared. Right? It needs to be shared, it needs to be outrageous. And so when you get something like a monetized platform like X, the kind of content that circulates most is the kind of content that is most outrageous. And the most outrageous thing is often exactly the collection of anti-progressive, anti-Obama era liberalism content that you were just describing there, right? So we have, obviously neo-Nazism is like the classic example. And combining that with the internet being a labor price arbitration machine, which is the thing we were talking about earlier. So combining the fact that you can drive prices, labor costs down to as low as possible globally. You can also automate a collection of things using AI. And what it gets shared is what's most outrageous. You get this incredibly strange phenomena, which is Sri Lankan influencers using AI to generate AI neo-Nazi slop that then gets shared on X, which is of course spreading hate about people who look like them, who are like, they're spreading hate against themselves, but they get money from it because it's monetized on the platform. There's no question here. I'm just sort of like inviting you to think about the kind of the labor dynamics and the how do we understand the broader frame here? Like, what is it just seems like, I don't have a question, actually. There is no question. I just feel like amazed by this particular example and the particular dynamics that it encases.
Yeah, and I think AI essentially makes it much easier to automate all of this because, in the era where you needed human content creators to create trust and authenticity and people would kind of follow them, the more, sloppified everything becomes, the less you need that kind of personal connection and sense of authentic following a creator on their journey. The more everything becomes just like little 3-second sound bites. It's just about the vibe and the aesthetic. And it's so easy now to create, because you have all the tools basically to clip everything, to create this content that is just basically generating money. And the things that the algorithms do privilege, as you said, is this kind of really terrible low quality slop. So I do like your little moral inversion framework. I haven't heard that before. Wait, do you know, was that from a particular person that you spoke to, or is this something that you guys came up with?
That was something I came up with myself. I have my own
Very good.
thoughts. I didn't even get Claude to have that thought for me, but
I like it.
as I normally would, of course. Thank you very much. Let's talk about struggle, right? Let's talk about the ways in which people push back against this. Obviously, on the kind of the user end, it's you just kind of scroll past slop, right? It's just the kind of thing that you have to sort of wade through. Let's talk about the African Content Moderators Union. You said earlier that they had managed to sue Meta. Let's talk about leverage points inside this global extraction machine. Where are those leverage points? Like, what power do workers have when we're talking about these kind of what's called business process outsourcing, BPO? When we're talking about this kind of global arbitration machine of labor, that can seem very opaque, that can seem very difficult to access. Where are the leverage points that workers have over the system?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways in which we could think about this. We could say that workers themselves, both in the global south and the global north, have a certain degree of power in terms of withholding their labor, also in terms of naming and shaming bad practices at companies. Consumers also have power because of the economic leverage they have over the firms. And we could say that there's a kind of civil society nexus. So universities, NGOs, people that are kind of participating in social movements in various ways that they can organize also to kind of hold companies to account, maybe to create new laws, to enforce existing laws. Um, the problem with AI and with the global production networks that it depends on is that the workers that are doing this kind of labor are now dispersed across the world, sometimes without direct communication with each other. And really, one of the key points of Marx's Capital was that he points out, look, all the workers are communicating with each other. They're all sitting in factories. They all have shared interests. They're all able to organize and talk and form unions and workers groups. That's actually really hard now because sometimes workers are sitting in their home on a computer, just doing micro tasks. Others are in a factory, but they're all on short-term contracts, and the people that are doing similar kinds of work are actually basically in competition with them over the other side of the world. And whereas in an era of physical industrial production where you had something like cars or sneakers that were being produced in large factories, it cost the capitalists a lot of money to have the fixed investment cost of the factory and all the machinery that was there. But when it comes to data work, where you basically just send a bunch of pictures or videos to a digital sweatshop, with the click of a button, you can just send that somewhere else. And so one of the sad stories that really was the result of a lot of the Kenyan workers organizing, including the lawsuit against Meta and the forming of the African Content Moderators Union, was a lot of that work just shipped somewhere else, right? It was basically a bit of a disaster for many of the workers who, despite the fact that they were really doing a very good job of like organizing and coming together and starting to, with very little help from the traditional labor movement in some instances, having these forms of organization and against very staunch resistance from their employers. It's just really difficult right now to for them to hold power, because as dispersed workers at the kind of bottom of the production network in some ways, there's only a limited amount of power that they can exercise over tech companies. And so what we talk about in the book is the need for transnational forms of organizing, where workers in the global north that are tech workers working at places like Google and Meta see themselves as in solidarity with other tech workers across the world. And I think earlier last decade, we did see much more successful forms of organizing in the 2010s, where you had workers organizing against military contracts. It kind of used to be in the early 2010s, it was like a real red line for someone like Google to work for the military, right? Or to produce weapon systems, I guess. That in this kind of Obama era liberalism, that was one of the big things. It was like, we are making the world a better place. In reality, we're just creating ad systems, but in our minds, we're making the world a better place. And that doesn't involve creating, Project Maven and other similar things. There's also kind of like a stand against the Israeli military and the kinds of weapons that might be used against Palestinian populations. But that is, I mean, they've just fired the workers now. Do you know what I mean? So there's that era where the tech companies felt themselves to be accountable to their workers and to the public on these various liberal metrics. In the Trump 2.0 era, it's almost like the opposite, right? So this tech for good sensibilities, I think, are over. And so that also closes a fundamental leverage point because suddenly you can't get a bunch of quite privileged and quite well resourced workers in San Francisco whose friends are journalists and will publish their stories and have all these connections and they have money and power. They can afford to not get paid for periods of time. The tech companies don't care anymore, right? Mark Zuckerberg is off hunting and creating a more manly workplace and appearing on Joe Rogan and doing all this stuff. Like the idea that they would care. I mean, even Anthropic, right? The recent, dispute that was had between Anthropic and the Department of War in the US and kind of OpenAI briefly taking over. There was this idea that Anthropic was being very principled and it was trying to preserve some red lines, but in reality, it agreed, and the CEO said as much. We agree with 99% of what the Department of War does. We're completely fine with the military application of our tools. We just have a couple of little caveats, basically. And in the end, the contracts are so valuable that they kind of, they worked it out, so to speak. And so we're no longer in an era where military applications of technology is a red line, where that would be a kind of point of resistance of global workers organizing together. And so I think honestly, it's a very difficult situation now for workers and civil society because we are in a kind of proto-fascist era where there are less leverage points and there's less organized power within the workers' movement and less able to create that kind of reputational risk for the companies.
James, thank you for doing your own research.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.